Welcome to Better Sex, where you get the information and inspiration to create and enjoy your best possible sex life. Join your host, sex therapist Jessa Zimmerman, as she brings you expert guests, helpful tips, knowledge, and strategies to improve your intimate relationships. And now, your host, Jessa Zimmerman.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jessa, and I'm so happy you're here for this episode of Better Sex. I've dedicated my professional life to helping couples enjoy a fulfilling, intimate life. I believe that sex is important. Our connections to other people matter, and we're not living our life to the fullest if we aren't connecting emotionally and sexually with our partner. That's why I'm here, bringing ideas and information to help you live and love better. Hey, my topic today, self-care. And you might wonder why I'm doing a self-care episode in the middle of a sex podcast, but it's relevant. You know, how we take care of ourselves affects what we have to give in relationship, and it affects what we can get from it. I mean, our basic overall well-being makes a big difference. And I hear this from couples in therapy a lot, that at least one of them feels completely overwhelmed. And actually, I can't tell you how many times people will say, you know what, I'd rather sleep than have sex. So that already doesn't speak to great self-care, right? Somebody's exhausted, they're overwhelmed, they're stressed. So that's one aspect. Self-care comes into play too with how is a relationship working for you? Are you getting what you need out of your relationship, out of your communication? I mean, there's so many different aspects of how we're doing individually that affect how we're going to do in relationship, what we want out of relationship, what we can get from it. It's important. So I have a self-care specialist today on the show. So Stacy Fisher-Gunn is the founder of Living Up, and actually Up is spelled UPP. And she's got a self-care planning and design company. She's an author, a speaker, a self-care designer with 18 years of experience in the healthcare industry as a registered dietitian and a certified diabetes educator. She's worked in a whole bunch of different settings, but she now works with individuals and organizations to design self-care strategies using her unique 8-dimensional self-care system. And we're going to talk about that in the show today. What are the 8 dimensions? How do they show up? How do they relate to relationship and sex? She's got a book called Upward, again with 2 Ps, a self-care system for purposeful living, and where she goes into a lot of detail about this. So I'm delighted that she's here to talk about self-care with me today. So Stacy, thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and I think, people may be surprised that I'm doing an episode on self-care in the middle of a sex podcast, but I think it's really crucial. I mean, I think this is relevant to so many ways people get stuck or sidetracked in their sex life. So I think it's really great that you're here to talk about it.
Absolutely. I mean, it's so universal to just daily life, and I think it absolutely is relevant.
Yeah. So first of all, what is self-care? Like, how do you define it? Because it may not be a term that everybody has heard.
You're right. It's not a very well-defined term, especially if you've read blogs and articles that have come up recently. It's definitely a topic that is growing in interest. And my definition is that it's a preventive health strategy, and it involves the actions and behaviors that either improve, restore, or maintain good health. And so that could also include if you have an existing condition, maybe you're managing hypertension or diabetes, it also involves managing those conditions in a way that prevents them from getting worse or improving your condition.
And I assume you're talking about mental health, emotional health, physical health. I mean, health on a broad band of aspects, right?
Absolutely. It covers a lot of ground when it comes to our well-being. We know there are lots of pieces and parts that make up our overall health.
Yeah. It's so interesting. I'm sitting here realizing, wow, I use the term self-care a lot. I'm familiar with the concept, but I haven't ever thought about it as preventative, which seems really silly now that you've said that out loud, right? Like it's so obvious. Why would we be doing it if it weren't? Well, I knew it was beneficial, but to prevent something negative from happening, that makes so much sense.
Yeah. And it's so interesting when we think about the definitions of self-care. I mean, it's not a new concept. It's definitely growing in momentum, and in our interpretations, I think, as a culture have taken it to different places. But I mean, the first time I remember hearing it, it was early in the 2000s. I was new in my career as a registered dietitian and diabetes educator. And it actually, the American Association of Diabetes Educators has what they call the AADE 7, and they are 7 core self-care behaviors for people managing that condition. So this term has been around for a long time.
Okay. So maybe it originated, I'm speculating here, in more of a medical context, the self-care that somebody with a condition might do. I'm also imagining dentists talking about your home care, that's self-care, right? That you do between your 6-month visits. And so maybe that idea of medical conditions or preventing that is where that might have started.
Yes.
And of course, it's gotten way broader now, right?
It has. And I think it's been estimated that 80% of all health-related care is self-care because it's what we do between doctor's appointments.
Right.
Exactly what you said about, you see the dentist periodically, and then you're kind of back to being on your own and needing to follow through with the recommendations.
Right. Well, there's similarity with therapy too, right? I see couples in my office and I always say we don't really do that much in here. It's all what happens in between sessions, right?
Yeah.
Checking in and course correcting, but it's the work off on your own that really is what adds up. All right. So you've got sort of a unique spin on self-care, right? With these 8 dimensions, I think is what you call them. Would you talk about what those 8 are and say a little bit about each one of them?
Sure. So I did come up with 8 dimensions of self-care because, you often hear mind, body, spirit. There's a lot that goes into taking care of ourselves. So the 8 dimensions that I've outlined are systemic. And by the way, the self-care, all 8 spell the word self-care, the first letter of each word.
Clever. I'm so
Yeah, it helps me remember because there's a useful reason I've done that. But systemic is how we eat, move, and rest. It's how we take care of our physical bodies. And it's probably the most common one people think of when they think of self-care.
Okay.
Emotive is the next one, and that's how we express ourselves. This is more of our emotions. This is your forte to a large degree among some of the others. Luminescent is our inner truth. This is what makes us unique individuals, our personalities, our life experiences, our personal beliefs, spiritual and otherwise. Financial is kind of self-explanatory, although it doesn't always mean just money. It's how we allocate our resources. Could be time, energy, that kind of thing. Cognitive is how we think. It's our mindset. If our mindset isn't focused on positive, healthy things, we're probably not going to make healthy choices. Aptitudinal is how we make a contribution to the world. This is our career. Doesn't always reflect what we're getting paid to do, but it's really our calling in life. It's what we were designed to do. The relational dimension, which I think we're talking a lot about today, is how we connect with others. And this includes our intimate relationships, our committed relationships, and also our family, friends, colleagues, community. It's a wide net. And then finally, environmental is how we harmonize with nature. Now, I also include in this one our personal spaces. So it's what is surrounding us. It's the greater piece. It's thinking beyond our inner circle of friends and how our behaviors impact everything around us, and how we interact with the world. So that's kind of the quick overview of the 8 dimensions of self-care.
Yeah. And even though, I can see how the emotive and the relational sort of directly relate to sex, well, to, an intimate relationship, I think self-care across the whole band, the whole rainbow of all of these, right, is important for having enough resources to show up and be in a relationship. So I'm curious I'm springing this on you, so we'll see what you say. But can you give a quick little synopsis for each one about maybe how people tend to get caught in trouble and what things to pay attention to? So maybe, first level on each of those?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we're all entering this idea of creating a self-care practice from different places. So when I meet with folks who are ready to kind of make a change and build a good foundation of taking care of themselves, sometimes one of these areas of their life is just like sounding like, hey, I need your attention. And a lot of times the luminescent dimension, which is really just knowing who we are and being comfortable in our own skin, that's a really good starting place for many people, because if you don't know who you are and you're not confident in who you are, it's hard to be part of a relationship, whether it's an intimate relationship or even just with your immediate family. Boundaries become issues, not knowing, how to ask for what you need. All of these things are symptoms of just not really knowing who you are.
And so if you're working with somebody that hasn't quite defined that or hasn't rounded that out or developed that, where do you start?
Yeah, so I have a number of ways that we can work through the process of sort of identifying these pieces and parts of who we are. And it's a really fun process, actually. It's part of what we do in the Self-Care Mastery Program. That's a year-long program that I've developed for people who are really committed to tackling all of these areas. And it's identifying some of these things that, quite honestly, Jessa, we knew when we were like 6 years old. And we were very clear about who we are and what our personality was and what our quirks and, the things that make us unique. But then we kind of get muted over time with trying to blend in.
Yeah, that makes sense. Wow, year-long mastery program. It does seem like it's that complex and nuanced and layered, and that this is not a surface kind of experience to try to really improve your self-care. So, and say a little bit about why you think having this diverse approach really matters. Like, these 8 levels that you've got, or these 8 dimensions. Why is that so critical?
Well, I think the main thing is that we are always changing. As individuals, we are growing, we're learning, we're evolving. And it's important for us just to really know what we need and find a way to get what we need. Because if we don't, then it shows up in other ways that can be unhealthy distractions. I've said before, problems with boundaries and just not being able to fully express yourself and be who you are. So I think it's important for us to know ourselves well enough that we can choose very specific self-care behaviors and activities. So you and I would likely have very different self-care plans.
Right.
Because we have different, I'm an introvert, so I like to do a lot of solo things. And so there's a lot of these, I guess it's very individualized, and it's not something you can just go grab a list online and say, oh, I'm going to do these 5 things and I'm going to be healthy and feel good enough to make a contribution to the world.
Right.
You have to really know yourself.
Yeah, I can see how it has to be completely customized to the person. And I'm imagining if the idea of self-care started in that you said systemic, right? The sort of health, body, fitness, eating, that kind of thing. People maybe hadn't thought beyond that, right? Like if I'm eating well and sleeping, like what's the problem? And it seems like this diverse approach you've got is really important to understand. Maybe you've got 1 or 2 of these just nailed down, but if you don't have the other ones, you could be suffering.
Yeah. And what you find, and again, this is not about perfection. It's not about being like perfect in every area, because our lives change so much that we're working in different dimensions all the time. But there can be roadblocks. So if financial is, if you've got some financial concerns going on, it's really hard the stress is a big component.
Right.
And it can interfere with being able to take care of yourself in other areas. Maybe it's working out and being able to be physically active. Now, a lot of self-care does not cost a thing. So most of what I have on my plan is free. It's just time. But yeah, it can definitely interfere with taking care of ourselves.
Yeah, time and awareness, right? It's just about creating, the mental space to realize you need this thing, and then how do you prioritize it in your life? Which is something that I do talk to clients about sex too, right? Like you've got this wonderful resource or opportunity and you have to fit this in somewhere. just like you have to fit in any other kind of self-care practice.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's the trick.
Yeah. Yeah. So, are you seeing trends in self-care? Like you said, it's sort of becoming more, it's more the mainstream culture. You're hearing this in different places now.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely, there's two main areas that I'm seeing. And one is that I think it's become, I mean, it's definitely mainstream. If you did a Google search, you would just see the search term climb, climb, climb. I mean, self-care is, you can't not read about it. And what I'm finding though is that many of these articles are very, very judgmental
Hmm.
in terms of saying, this is self-care and this isn't. And so, it's not all bubble baths and spa days. Of course it isn't. But for some people and in some situations, those are absolutely relevant and necessary ways to take care of ourselves. So
Right.
I
Right.
am seeing this kind of like, I guess you're assigning this is good, this is bad when it comes
Huh.
to self-care. And so part of the message that I bring is that you get to decide what self-care is for you. And that's why we need to experiment. Maybe it isn't, the bubble bath thing is just not for you. It does nothing for you. But if that's your only time in the evenings that helps you unwind and get a great night's sleep, then maybe that needs to be
Right. Right.
of your strategy. So that's one trend, is just people are starting to experiment with it and decide for themselves what it is or isn't. But I just caution people when they read articles to, decide for yourself what
Yeah.
it looks like. And the second is, I think we're going to start seeing more self-care manifest in actual healthcare.
Hmm.
Many governments, they're using self-care as a strategy to manage healthcare costs. And I think it's a big thing for us to consider too when we're thinking about how much money we're spending on healthcare, to really think of the power we have in being able to care for ourselves, to prevent some
Yeah.
of those visits to the doctor when they may not, with proper care of ourselves and getting enough sleep and all of these things to help prevent.
Yeah. 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 I'm back in my mind to the dentist example. Like, wow, if I really take care of my teeth in between visits, I'm going to save myself a ton of, money and time and maybe pain. Right.
Yes.
And I can see that makes sense across the whole spectrum. Hi, it's Jessa here, taking just a quick break. Thanks for listening so far. I wanted to let you know about the sex quiz that I've put together called How Healthy Is Your Sex Life? I've taken a close look at the typical ways that I see couples get into trouble with sex, including avoidance, neglect, negativity, distraction, and boredom. And the free quiz will score your individual results based on these factors. And then I provide my recommendations and ideas, including my top 10 sex tips, which will help you make instant improvement. If you'd like to take the quiz and see how healthy your sex life is, you can do it right now at sexhealthquiz.com. I had another thought when you brought up the bubble baths. I had this question in my mind, like, are there things people do that are part of their self-care plan that hit easily a number of those different dimensions, or do they tend to be singular? Like, what's, is something power packed if it hits 5 of them, or something? Are those the gems that you want to find?
Oh my goodness, I'm so glad you brought that up, Jessa. It's my favorite thing, actually, because and I call it stacking.
Okay.
And it is actually a permaculture term, but stacking is when you can find one thing, one activity, one behavior that hits multiple areas. And the more areas it hits, the more likely you're going to do it consistently, for one. But the more fulfilling it's going to be. If you're thinking about self-care in terms of filling your cup so that you have energy to give, which is, to me, it's the point of it, is yes, staying well, but why? So that we can give back, so that we have more to give to our families and communities. But when we can find, so here's an example. Maybe it is, to strengthen your intimate relationship and you want to spend more quality time with your significant other, taking a walk together. Let's think about that for a second. You are carving out time to talk, to be open, to communicate. So you're nurturing your relational dimension.
Mm-hmm.
You're getting physical activity. So that's hitting the systemic dimension there.
Okay.
For me and for many people, physical activity also supports the emotive dimension. Your emotional, the endorphins that you get from exercise just helps your emotional well-being, probably even cognitive, because your mindset is, driving how you're responding to things that happen to you. And also if you're walking in nature, you've got like this environmental component.
Right.
So you could be hitting 5, and maybe you're talking about business. So you've got,
Well, I'll add another. It's also free, right? So if you're trying to, instead of going out to dinner on a date or something like that, you're doing something that's free, which maybe helps your financial self-care too.
Yep, you got it.
Okay. So that's a great example. So people can be thinking about stacking these behaviors. Okay. So let's talk a little, specifically about the relational dimension, since that's, tied to sex and relationships. So what are some of the ways that maybe people are getting stuck? What are the things people might do to nurture that part of their self-care and thus their relationship?
Yeah. So, and I'm sure you talk a lot about this, and maybe as you start thinking about the common things you're talking about with couples, you'll start to see that those are really self-care behaviors and activities.
Yeah.
But I think first it involves having conversations about what you both need. And sometimes those are candid conversations, and sometimes they're difficult conversations. But I think knowing what you need, and then in turn knowing what the other person needs, so that you can create those conditions so that you're both getting fulfilled. So what I mean by that is that, for example, just knowing what kinds of things the other person likes to do. So my husband and I trade each week. We take turns planning a date night. So it could be, as you said, maybe it's cooking in and going for a walk, or, listening to music, or it could be going out to do something. I think one time we went to the circus just because we were both goofy and it was just an element of just surprise or something,
Yeah.
do something different. But just knowing what the other person needs, and or if you're into the love language thing and you know how the other person receives love, then you can begin to plan more of those kinds of activities to do together.
Mm-hmm. And again, when I'm thinking about this and being self-care, I'm thinking, wow, what do I need out of my relationship? Or what do I need to change so that I feel better in my relationship? Like there is an aspect of speaking up for self in this, obviously in terms of tending to your partner too. But if it's self-care, it's got to start with that self-awareness about how is my relationship feeling to me, right? And how am I doing in it?
And what's interesting is, and I say this so often, but self-care is not a solo gig.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, as we just were talking about the stacking, when we can involve other people somehow in our core self-care practice, we get way more fulfilled than if only just about us. So it could even be that you and your spouse or your partner go volunteer together. And that could be a way to spend time together. But you're also, it's hard to even explain, as anyone who's volunteered knows, when you're doing something that is helping someone else or your community, whether it's the food bank, community garden, there are tons of ways to get involved, but you're connecting on so many more levels that it fills up both of your cup. And then, like, how do you not relate better together?
Yeah.
Feel better as a couple when you're able to do things like that together.
Yeah. So from your perspective, what are some of the signs that people might have that their self-care needs tending? Like, because people must sort of drift through their life without thinking about this much and everything's fine, right? So what are some of the, I guess I'd say, wake up calls or something that people might be experiencing?
So when people come to me and when the topic of self-care comes up in just conversation and when people get really engaged in conversation, usually they're feeling pretty overwhelmed.
Okay.
Life gets really busy. It's hard to say no to things. So you say yes to everything. And so boundaries are a big one for people who aren't able to say no or create space in their life to do things that are nurturing. Because when our calendars get so full and we don't even have time to breathe, it's easy for all of those things to go bye-bye. Like, I can't sleep because my mind is racing, or I'm short-tempered with my kids because I'm not at my best game. I haven't been eating well. I've gained weight. The relationship side is taking a hit because, who wants to be, if you're crabby all the time, it's kind of hard to be able to want to spend time together and fun things. And maybe even your work is suffering. Maybe the aptitudinal dimension suffering. So there are all kinds of symptoms, but I use a tool called Rate Your 8.
Okay.
And it's an exercise I do every single morning. It takes 20 seconds. And I basically go through each dimension and rank on a scale of 1 to 10. How well am I supporting myself?
Huh.
And over time, I've been doing this for probably close to a year now, is I can pretty much predict, okay, if I don't get a handle on this, if I don't address this, if I don't say what I'm thinking, if I don't, stop saying yes to everything, then I'm going to have a meltdown or something,
Right. Or whatever your trap is, right? Get sick or whatever, whatever it might be.
Exactly. If we don't slow down, our bodies will slow us down.
Right.
So it's a predictive model, I guess, for being able to say, okay, this needs a little bit more attention and love, and I need to put my energy here today, because nobody has 8 hours to give to self-care a day.
Right.
I mean, we might have 5 minutes, we might have an hour. So we have to prioritize where we're going to spend our time.
Yeah. And certainly I hear from clients all the time, one of the biggest obstacles in somebody's intimate relationship, in their sex life, at least the one I hear the most, is feeling overwhelmed, right? They're exhausted. Life is crazy. It's sort of sex has fallen to the bottom of the priority list. And they certainly come in with a sense of, certainly maybe a sense of lack of boundaries, but just overwhelm, stress, worry, that kind of thing. So it's wonderful to hear that self-care can go a long way towards taking care of this stuff. It's not something you always have to pay a professional for help or something like that, right? Self-care is going to be, would you say 80%?
Yeah. It's the majority of our health is us deciding how we're going to make choices every day.
Yeah. So last question is, how would you be willing to share how you use this 8-dimension framework for yourself? Like, I don't know if you want to give examples, how personal you want to get here, but what this looks like for you in terms of a self-care plan.
Yeah, this it's constantly evolving. I'll say that. But what I love is I've actually published last year a self-care planner that helps me keep it all straight. And a big part of it is what I just described in doing this Rate Your 8 activity every morning as part of what I do in my routine when I wake up. Meditation is part of that, getting physical activity in. And I try not to be overly prescriptive with some of these things because I want to leave it open if I want to go for a hike or if I want to walk on my treadmill or whatever that looks like, then I don't feel boxed in by it, but I do need to move my body.
Yeah.
And so this having a place to track what I'm doing, and research backs this up. Anytime you are changing a behavior, if you're tracking your progress in some way, shape, or form, you can see it isn't a pass or fail. It isn't a, I'm terrible because I didn't do this. It's a learning tool.
Yeah.
So you can say, maybe I really just don't like doing that and I want to choose something else because it's not helpful for me.
Yeah.
I personally use that because it keeps me accountable. And that's a big part of why I do what I do, is that all of us have wonderful intentions. When we wake up in the morning, day is going to be different. And then it's 10 p.m. and we're still feeling behind. So a lot of times I discover that self-care is more about letting go of some things that you have said yes to make space in your life for the important things like having sex and having time with your partner.
Yeah.
Then taking on one more volunteer assignment from the school district, or something like that. So it becomes just knowing yourself and saying, nope, I don't need that anymore, but here's what I really need.
Yeah. Great. So how can people learn more about you, about your program, and say a little bit about where they can find you?
Yeah, so they can find me at livingup.com, and up has 2 P's. And the Self-Care Mastery Program, you can find more information about what that looks like, what's included, and how I work with folks. And if you'd like to schedule a strategy session, there's a link as well to be able to, we can chat for 30 minutes and I'll give you at least one takeaway that you can start using immediately. And yeah, I love to be a resource if you're thinking something needs to change. I can't keep running like a crazy person, constantly feeling behind. There's a sense of balance and peace and joy that's missing in a lot of lives. And I think self-care plays a big role in helping recover that.
Yeah, I do too. I think this is so important. So thanks again for being with me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Jessa.
You're welcome.
You've been listening to Better Sex. Please visit our website, bettersexpodcast.com, for show notes and additional episodes.
And that's a wrap for today. I really hope you enjoyed the episode. If you are enjoying the podcast, if some of this material resonates with you and you would like to make a difference and make sure that this keeps coming out in the world once a week, ongoing, there are a couple things you could do to show your appreciation. The first would be to go to iTunes and rate and review the show. That really helps us be found by new listeners when you review the show on iTunes. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/iTunes. The other thing I want to invite you to consider is becoming a Patreon. For a small monthly pledge, you get some benefits. So for $2 a month, you get advance access to every single episode. For $5 a month, you get a chapter of my upcoming new book. And for $10 a month, I host quarterly get-to-know-you and question-and-answer chats over the web, and you get invited to that. I would love to have your membership in that, become part of the Better Sex family. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/Patreon, which is Patreon. Again, thanks for listening. I'm glad you're here. Feel free to comment, ask questions, get in touch. I'd love to hear from listeners. Thanks.